Hey listeners, it's AZ. Welcome back to episode 66 of the Fire Rescue Wellness Podcast, where today you're going to hear from Dr. Brooke Bartlett. She is a licensed clinical psychologist and the owner of the Center for Trauma, Anxiety, and Stress. In addition to being a trauma specialist, she very much specializes in working with first responders and military members. She does scientific research and frequently publishes in first responder editorials such as Fire Rescue One. I really think you're going to love this conversation. Call to action for today. If you're picking up what Dr. Brooke is laying down, hit the link in the show notes and book her for a talk at your department. Thank you for joining me on the Fire Rescue Wellness Podcast. I'm your host, AZ. I find the research and resources and then provide the fire service with the so what, now what, to ensure the health and well-being of every member of our profession. Together, let's thrive. Hey, podcast listeners, it's AZ with the Fire Rescue Wellness Podcast, and I am back for yet another episode. And today I am joined by Brooke Bartlett. Say hello to my listeners.
Hello there, everyone.
I'm really excited for this conversation because, as my listeners know, I say this all the time, the people I interview are my friends. And you and I, as of a couple months ago, just simply were friends that hadn't met yet. Mm-hmm. So now we're friends.
Here we are.
We are. I'm excited to have you today, but I'm going to start with the 3 rapid fire get to know you questions. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
All right. Who is Dr. Bartlett?
Well, I am a licensed clinical psychologist, which basically means I spent 12 to 14 seemingly never-ending years in school and training to be able to call myself that. I specialize specifically in trauma, anxiety, and all the things that are associated with that, like sleep issues and substance abuse and misuse and anger and guilt and shame. Those are the big ones. Moral injury falls within that as well. And I have a very specific specialty in working with military and first responders. So I always knew I wanted to go into specialize in working with military related to trauma. And right when I started my Ph.D., I immediately started working with a very large fire department and just immediately fell in love with working with first responders as well. So I spent all of my time in the research lab doing research and publishing and out in the field responding on scene and in the therapy room with first responders. So I did spend a lot of time kind of becoming specialized in that. Aside from that, I also have a personal life, and now I do. When I was going through those 10 years, not so much. It was just all work. But I'm a former collegiate athlete, so I really like your episodes, focused on nutrition, functionality, all of that. So that was me in my former life, big into hiking, staying active, love dogs, got a couple myself. So that's me.
And you know what, you mentioned when we were speaking last week that you were a former collegiate athlete, but I didn't ask you what variety. Tell me more.
Yeah, so I was a tennis player from the age of 4 on to when I had to retire, 5 hours a day, 6 days a week, 12 months out of the year. And, went homeschooled and everything just to train and travel and all of that. So in my head, I was like, maybe I'll become a professional tennis player. My body had a very different plan. So by the time I was in my early 20s, 20 years old, my body was already falling apart. I had a torn up rotator cuff, which was really the primary injury that I still have. It wasn't like an immediate, snap or anything. It was just wear and tear. Like it looks like a worn out rope. That was my former life. And then I was like, well, what the hell am I going to do now? It's a very big identity crisis, and ended up pursuing this.
Okay, big question here. Pickleball, yes or no?
So as of recently, yes. And let me tell you why. 1, it's fun. 2, I'm good at it because I transfer my skills from tennis and I like things that I'm good at. 3 is that it doesn't hurt my injuries. I can play the sport and enjoy it, and it's low impact. And, it's one of the few things that I can do without feeling, this array of injuries. So I do enjoy it.
We have a pickleball court next to several of our fire stations, and those people are serious about it. So
Yeah, I
serious.
just joined a league, so I'm really getting out there. Going to do some tournaments and everything.
Holy cow. Well, I'm going to have to put you in contact with my friend Julie, who's a strength and conditioning coach, probably nowhere near you in California, but she specializes in training pickleball players.
Oh, yes, please do.
All right, we are way off the rails already. So what I want to know next is what sets your soul on fire?
That's a good question. I absolutely love what I do for work. It truly sets my soul on fire. I love working with those who serve us. I love serving those who serve others. It's such a need among military and first responders. It is not the same as working with civilians. And I just really love seeing someone progress, seeing someone get the help that they need, whether it be through a training or talk that I've given at an agency, having someone reach out to me 3 months later and say, I really resonated with what you were saying, and it made me realize I needed help. Doing therapy with a first responder and them getting to the point where they regain their life back. That just absolutely sets my fuel on fire, fuels my fire. And, when I see these headlines that we are all just seeing so often with first responders dying by suicide and all these other things happening, those types of things set my soul on fire as well, because I'm like, this is so incredibly needed. How can I reach as many people as possible? So.
And that's the tough part. The message is getting out there, but yet I feel like it's not getting out there fast enough, effectively enough. I don't know. We're not reaching everyone. So we're figuring it out. Mm-hmm. All right. Last tough question. How are you changing the world?
Oh, this is a tough question for someone who has an irrational fear of sounding braggy. Let's see. I'd say I'm changing the world by being someone who's on the forefront, who truly specializes in working with first responders and working to break that stigma related to seeking help, to needing help, having to break through that. I've really found over time anecdotally that I'm working with one person who reaches out for help, and then they start to be more open with others about, what they've experienced or the help that they've received, that it's just a trickle down effect. And I think that being at the forefront of that and helping to contribute to that destigmatization of mental health and needing help, the helpers need help too. And I think that's a way that I'm changing the world.
I would definitely agree. And listeners, just remember way back, I don't even remember what episode it was, when I spoke with Chris Fields. And the big thing that Chris Fields said was, if you've got a story to tell, you need to tell it. And what I add to that is, don't leave out the bad parts. We're so willing to talk about our saves and our jobs and our whatever. We're so willing to talk about that. Why are we so unwilling to talk about the things that would help another person? Mm-hmm. Not sure.
It's a great point.
All right. So while you were talking about what sets your soul on fire, you mentioned, and I wrote it down so I wouldn't forget, it is not the same as working with civilians. Working with first responders is not the same as working with civilians. And at the very core of it, we probably all go, yeah, right. But tell me more. Tell me more about what you meant by that.
Yeah, there's a few different things that go into that. One of them is that there's a very important cultural aspect that you need to be well-versed in and familiar with when it comes to first responders. There's, of course, so many different types of cultures if we're talking about ethnicity or religion or all these things, but first responder culture is a thing, and it's very important to be familiar with it when you're going into, let's say, a therapy room with a first responder, right? They don't want to spend 6 sessions teaching you, what this means and what that means and how important the camaraderie is and all these things, right? So knowing the culture of the first responder world is so important. It's just not the same as working with a civilian, right? The other part of it is, so I specialize in very specific evidence-based treatments, particularly for, like I said, trauma and PTSD and anxiety and sleep and whatnot. And what I mean by evidence-based is these have scientific support showing that they're effective in treating what they are intended to treat. And a lot of these evidence based treatments are protocols, meaning that it's very specific and has an agenda every single session, has homework outside of session. They're very, very specific, right? So it's not just someone coming into my office and me saying, "Hi, how was your week? Tell me more about that." That's tough, right? So we have a very specific agenda, a very specific schedule. And so some of these treatments were not necessarily designed or were not designed for first responders. And so, for example, in one of the treatments I specialize in called cognitive processing therapy or prolonged exposure for PTSD, they, as in, the people who created it, it's basically what you're supposed to do is have your client pick the worst trauma, identify one trauma, and then we work from there. Say that to a first responder and say, well, tell me the worst trauma you've experienced. They're like, the hell are you talking about? You want me to pick one? Right? So it's things like that of knowing, not only being competent in knowing how to provide these evidence-based treatments, just generally speaking, knowing how to do it, but also being able to mold the two together, right? There's certain things that you have to adjust for a first responder to fit their needs as opposed to a civilian. Another example is, we're not trying to completely remove hypervigilance that you see in post-traumatic stress. Hypervigilance, being able to detach from emotions, is adaptive when you're on the job, right? But we want to balance it so that we're not completely cut off and hypervigilant to the point where it's hard to function when off the job. So those are examples of the difference between working with civilians and working with first responders.
And I keyed into one thing that you said because it is one of my favorite topics in the world, which is sleep. And
Yes.
what I always remind people of is our first responders are merely civilians who have taken on a really hard job, and then we traumatize them and we sleep deprive them.
Yep.
So can you educate my listeners a little bit more about why sleep is so critical, especially in our population?
Sleep is, I would argue, the most critical thing to our mental and physical health. There is a plethora of research. Now, in the last 10 years, because of technology, research on sleep has just boomed, right? We know so much more. Up until the last 20 years, we were all like, well, why the hell do we sleep? It's evolutionarily doesn't seem very adaptive, right? We're not awake. We can't fight against predators, all these things. What is going on during sleep? Sleep is so incredibly important to our physical and mental health. It is associated with, or poor sleep is associated with every type of chronic medical disease. It significantly increases the risk for things like dementia and Alzheimer's disease, and it significantly increases things like depression, PTSD, all these aspects. So sleep is so incredibly important. So when I have an agency reach out to me and they're like, we want you to come do a training or speak, with our agency, we only have the funding, for one topic for you to come once. What should we focus on? Sleep. I always say sleep because it's the most important and it is the most addressable. There's things that people, first responders, can do that are within their own control that can improve their sleep. So I'm like, let's go with that.
And that is the exact answer I give to when the agency says, we can only afford to have you talk about one thing. It is always sleep. So there are things within, they've all heard my bullshit before. I want them to hear it from you. You said there are things that first responders can do to take control and improve their sleep. Let's talk about some of those things.
Yeah, absolutely. So one thing that I really like to highlight is, I understand, being me coming in and being like, well, let's talk about how you can get more sleep on your shift, right? That can be very difficult. It can be very difficult to manage. So what I really like to focus on is, let's focus on what you're doing off shift, right? The importance of prioritizing sleep when you're off shift. Some of the main things to do, oh gosh, I could spend a lot of time talking about this. But some of the main things to do are simple things like making sure trying to go to bed around the same time at night, limiting looking at electronics while in bed or in your room, not laying in bed when you're not asleep. That's a big one. I specialize in cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia. It's a purely behavioral approach to treating sleep difficulties. One big thing, the motto is, you are only in bed when you are asleep. If you're not asleep, you're out of bed, right? So behaviorally getting yourself, create a sanctuary in your room that feels comfortable, cool it down, put blackout curtains over your windows. All these different things are so important. What I see with a lot of my first responders is that they're on shift, they're not sleeping because that's what's required of the job. They get off shift and then maybe they go out for drinks one night with their friends. They're out past midnight, and then the next night they're doing this. And all of a sudden they go back into work. They didn't sleep at all, right? Or not very well. And then it just continues and accumulates. So it has to be a very proactive approach to prioritizing sleep. It doesn't just happen on its own, but to prioritizing sleep when off the job.
The listeners couldn't see it, but I did a chair dance while you were saying that because it's so true. You know, when you raised your right hand, to some extent, you lost some control of how you spend your time while you're on duty, but you still have this wonderful control off duty.
Yeah.
All right. I love going down the rabbit hole of sleep, but I'm going to pull us back out of the rabbit hole and move back to that sort of topic. You know, we take these civilians, we sleep deprive them and traumatize them. How can we do a better job setting up our probationary firefighters for success, mental health success in career and life?
Yeah, that's a great question. One thing that I think is so incredibly powerful. Okay, let me scoot back a little bit. In my work, I very, very, very much emphasize proactive approach. What I mean by that is that a lot of agencies have reactive systems set in place, which are absolutely needed and should be there. Things like, someone commits suicide, someone's in a severe crisis. Okay, we bring in the peer support teams, we bring in the chaplains, etc. And again, much needed. We also need to put just as much emphasis, if not more, on the proactive side of things, right? And that means that let's keep the healthy people healthy. Or let's keep the people who are starting to have a little bit of issues, maybe starting to notice something. Let's intervene before the snowball continues to roll and rolls off the cliff entirely, right? So with that being said, we're talking about what we can start doing more, particularly with probationary, et cetera, is start getting this information out there to them. Psychoeducation is so important, and it is understated in this field of how important psychoeducation. We don't know what we don't know, right? And so psychoeducation not only brings knowledge to first responders, particularly those entering the career who are new to it, but then they're more likely to be able to identify if and when they start experiencing some of these issues. Right? I always tell people, this is my analogy. I'm a big analogy person. So my analogy is psychoeducation to me is basically if I said, okay, AZ, I point to a little hole in the wall right there. And I gave you some tools and I said, can you go patch up that wall for me? And you'd be like, sure, no problem. Then I shut off the lights and it was completely pitch black and you couldn't see anything in the room. Well, I don't even know how to fix it because I can't even see where it is. I don't even know where it is. That's what psychoeducation is. It turns off on the light so that someone can see and be able to identify when maybe there's a hole that needs to be, patched up a little bit.
So I have actually not heard that term before. So can you tell me a little bit more about that? It's turning on the lights, but how?
Yeah. So psychoeducation, for example, let's say I'm brought in to do sleep, right? What psychoeducation is basically let's talk about what sleep does, why it's important to sleep, what sleep is related to physically, what sleep is related to mentally, what are signs and symptoms of things that start to happen when we start to get sleep deprived, right? People think that you just feel tired. It's like, no, I can function off 4 hours sleep, no problem. I'm like going through my day, but things like irritability and anger, things like kind of my brain keeps kind of clonking out on me, right? Just like brain dead sometimes, things like this that maybe we can just push through, but things to start noticing, right? So psychoeducation not only brings information about that topic, but then it also brings awareness to what are things to look out for in myself and others. What is that when that check engine light, to know when that check engine light goes on of like, okay, I need to start actually putting some concerted effort into improving my sleep right now so that it doesn't worsen. That's basically what psychoeducation is.
Perfection. I think that is a perfect way to educate first responders. And so I love that you talked about the fire service and first responders being reactive, because We are. It's literally what we do for a career. We
Mhm.
see a fire, we put out a fire, and then we go wait for the next one to start. Maybe we do a little fire prevention in the meantime,
Mhm.
but that's just how we're trained to quote unquote respond. And so those upstream interventions like sleep are super important. So, can you give us a few more upstream interventions that can impact our mental health positively?
So outside of sleep, you mean?
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Are you asking about specifically like actual therapy protocols, or just tips and things to kind of focus on?
Let's talk about therapy protocols. Let's talk about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I already mentioned CBTI, which is specifically for insomnia or sleep issues. It is one of my favorite protocols to do because it is just about 99% behavioral. And what I mean by that, we're not really getting into, what beliefs do you have that are affecting the way you behave, things like this, which is the basis of cognitive behavioral therapy. CBTI is, we have a sleep tracking chart. The person has to every day track very specific things. We modify their behavior based on that. And in about 4 to 6 weeks, boom, they're out. They're sleeping better. So that's CBTI. And it's very good. You don't need to have full blown insomnia, but for someone who's having sleep issues, there's a lot of good things that can come out of CBTI. I also mentioned CPT, which is cognitive processing therapy. That is one of a couple of evidence-based treatments for post-traumatic stress. I really like to emphasize to people that you do not need to have a diagnosis of PTSD in order to benefit from these treatments, right? Any level of trauma exposure that is now affecting you, that you think is related to how you're feeling or how you're acting, any of your symptoms, these treatments can help. And so, what cognitive processing therapy does is it basically very systematically and uh, narrowly identifies how trauma has affected the way you view yourself, others, and the world. We identify how your outlook in life has really been affected and changed by trauma. So, for example, a common one that you hear with trauma exposed people who are experiencing any form of post traumatic stress is surrounding trust, right? So, maybe when I was growing up, I never thought much about trust. Glass half full kind of person, and I trust someone until they show me that I can't trust them. What happens a lot of times with post-traumatic stress is we start to get to the point where it's like no one can be trusted. Honestly, I don't even really trust the people closest to me. Like, I love them, but I still keep myself, a 6-foot pole in between myself and them. And so what happens is these types of shifts in belief systems surrounding trust, how you view yourself as a mother, father, parent, how you view safety, all these different things really impact how you actually interact with the world around you. Because if, for example, I don't think anyone can be trusted, then I'm certainly not going to foster new relationships or maintain the relationships I already have. I'm going to be really recluse. I'm going to probably isolate as much as I can off shift. I'm not really going to go out and about, right? So it really does impact that. So CPT really targets that. And what we do is we restructure those belief systems. And again, in a very systematic way. And the point of restructuring them is getting them in line with reality. Because a lot of times these belief systems are very black and white. No one can be trusted. That's not factually true. It's true that some people can't be trusted, but that's not the belief system. The belief system is no one can, right? So we restructure them so that they're more in line with reality and they don't make us feel as much like shit, right? So that's the goal in CPT.
That's amazing. And as you were talking, you know, it is very difficult to be a first responder. It has got to be even more difficult to be in a relationship with a first responder. So
Yeah.
I'm putting myself in the shoes of, say, a first responder spouse, and then watching, so to say, this belief system change
Yep.
right in front of my eyes. That's got to be incredibly, incredibly difficult.
Absolutely. I mean, so the work I do with first responders and their loved ones, right? And so that's really important because the loved ones, in a way, are obviously they're not on the job doing the actual day to day of the job, but they feel it too, right? They see their partner, their loved one, or their father or their mother. They see the way the job impacts them. and they're trying to just figure out how to fit in that, right? And then the first responder is also trying to figure out how to fit in with their family that they feel like they've grown so far apart from, right? So it really does impact the loved ones as well, particularly when we're talking about post-traumatic stress, trauma-related symptoms.
Unbelievable. So when we were chatting on the phone last week, I believe you told me about a couple other protocols that you work with.
Mm-hmm.
You want to riff on those too?
Yeah. Let's see. Another one that I like to highlight that is not as, I'd say not as popular yet, only because what it treats is not as well acknowledged in the first responder world, but it's called trauma-informed guilt reduction therapy. It is a long name, but for short, Trigger. DRIGR. Okay. And what that addresses is moral injury. One of my favorite things to talk about and work with first responders. Do you know what moral injury is?
I think I do, but I don't want to make a fool of myself by answering wrong. So I'll just let you explain.
Okay. So moral injury basically was originally coined by researchers who were working with combat veterans. And what they were finding was that they had these combat veterans coming in presenting with what looked like PTSD. They'd treat them with cognitive processing therapy or prolonged exposure. 3 months later, at the end of their treatment, they no longer met criteria for PTSD. So their PTSD symptoms had gone down, but yet they were still experiencing these very specific debilitating symptoms that were just derailing their lives. And the researchers were like, what the hell is going on? What is this? So they ended up identifying it as moral injury. And what moral injury is basically when we perceive that there's been some kind of violation of what we think is moral, what our morals are, what we value. This can be either that we believe someone else has violated that, we've witnessed someone else doing something terrible that's violated that. We think that we could have or should have done something that we didn't do that's violated that. And what it leads to, all roads lead to one place with moral injury, and it's guilt and shame. And there are so many first responders that struggle with guilt and shame related to their line of work. Okay. Some of the most prominent ones, like I said, notice I'm using the word perceived. Okay. Just because someone feels like they've done something wrong or should have done something different doesn't actually mean that they did something wrong. So I see a lot with first responders. Let's say I'm working with someone who's crew member, close friend, died by suicide. And they're like, I blame myself. It's my fault. I should have seen the signs. If I had just done this, if I had just done that, they would still be there. Or if I had just responded quicker to this scene, that child would still be alive, right? Things like that. Could have, should have, would have, if I should have done this. 99% of the time, 99.99% of the time, there is nothing actually that person could have done, but they're acting in hindsight as if I had just known that this was going to happen, then I could have stopped it, right? But they're carrying that burden and that guilt, right? So that's one thing that Trigger really addresses, is that there's a lot of other common moral injury experience among first responders is the moral injury of I love my job and I'm fully committed and loyal to my job. And I want to be a good family member as well. I want to be a good father, mother, husband, partner, daughter, whatever it is. But these two things come into conflict because, as you know, being a first responder is not like a Monday through Friday 9 to 5 job, right? You're on the jobs 24, 48, 72 hours, maybe some overtime. You're gone. You're missing holidays. You're missing birthdays. You're missing kids' recitals. You're missing all these things. So what happens for some first responders over time is they start to experience a lot of guilt, right? How do I balance these two things out? I'm a terrible father. I'm a terrible mother. I'm missing these things. I'm not the person I thought I should be to my family. And so they just start to develop a lot of guilt. So what Trigger does is we really start to identify what is leading to that guilt. We first do a lot of psychoeducation about guilt and why we have guilt and different types of guilt. And then we start to identify what is leading to that guilt. And then similar to what I was explaining with cognitive processing therapy, we start to restructure those, get the facts around could you have really seen this coming, right? I've worked with military combat vets who are like, I should have seen that this IED was planted in front of our convoy and then I could have saved it. We really go in systematically and over and over again, re-examine the facts from a 360 view and then say, what is the actual reality and facts here, right? And that takes time, but then we start to restructure that so that what you're telling yourself actually fits with reality, and it doesn't make you feel like shit anymore.
I think that sounds fantastic. And can we stay on guilt and shame for a second?
Yeah, please.
So I have noticed in the fire service that a lot of our teaching is done by shaming. So, you go through a drill, you maybe don't do it the exact way the instructor, you get the job done, but you don't do it the exact way the instructor might have. So instead of just saying, you got the job done, that isn't the way I would have done it, there's this big shame component to it. And that feels shitty.
Mm-hmm.
There's that. And then there's we shame each other. We do a lot of talking about each other. And I think it's a deflection. Like if I can talk about someone else's shit and make them the topic of the conversation, then they can't be talking about my shit.
Mm-hmm.
Does any of that track, or am I just making this? Is this a narrative I made up in my head?
Oh, I don't think it's a narrative you've made up in your head. I've seen that a lot. And I agree with you. I think there's a lot of shame around a lot of different things in the first responder culture. I mean, if we're even just talking about mental health or strength or what all that means, right? Being affected whatsoever by the job means you're weak, means you're this, means you're that. It could also even lead to actual logistical consequences, like not getting that promotion, being ostracized from your crew because now they don't trust you anymore because, oh my gosh, they think you're crazy because you're having trouble with this, right? All these different things. And then I see a lot of that kind of more personal trash talk that you're talking about that I do agree at times could be a bit of a deflection.
So in January, I encouraged my crew. I'm the lieutenant, so I can truly make the rules, but I didn't make this a rule. I just said I'd like to try this. I would like to try, if you have something shitty to say about someone else, I want you to say it to them. And if that doesn't get the result that you're looking for, then it's still over, because saying it to us, saying shitty things about other people to us at the dinner table isn't going to help that result either. And I think it just draws the whole morale of the whole agency down.
Yep.
I don't know if it's had any impact, but I feel better about it.
I think that's a really good approach. But I mean, you're right. There is a sociological component to the more we all kind of like talk about this really shitty thing, the more angry we get about it and the worse we feel about it, right? We all just kind of start to go down into this spiral. And so again, that's a sociological phenomenon that we do, whether it's in the fire service or out of the fire service, that ends up to some degree becoming maladaptive, starts to have a negative impact, not only on the individual, but on the group as a whole.
All right. I'm going to keep doing it. I only have like 6 months left, but I'm going to keep trying.
Yeah.
So let's now imagine I'm a firefighter. I've been on the job for close to 20 years. I didn't have the benefit of kind of getting some education on the front end. And now I realize, like, wow, I really, really need some help. And I raise my hand. I say, help me. I make an appointment with you or another counselor. Tell the listeners kind of what that looks like. Of course, only working with you, but tell the listeners what that would look like. Because I think sometimes if we can bring them some level of comfort, I think that perhaps they would be more willing to ask for help.
Yeah, knowing what it is to expect can be a scary thing. So like you said, I can only speak for myself and what that looks like. But basically what happens is if someone reaches out to me, say they're looking for therapy, looking for help, I always do a free consultation call. And that's really important for many reasons. The two most important reasons are, one, I want to make sure that whatever it is that you need help with, that it's something that I am competent in treating, right? And that's another important part of being specialized and being a good psychologist, is that you need to know, if someone comes to me, let's say suffering from an eating disorder, it's not my specialty, I refer them out. So I need to make sure that what you're looking for is something that I am specialized and have expertise in treating. The second and very, very important part of that consultation call, so you can talk to me. You can ask all your questions that you have. It's meant to be a platform so that before you book an appointment with me, you get a feel for me. Is this someone that I can see eventually forming a, professional therapeutic trust with? Is this someone that I feel comfortable with off the bat on the phone, right? I always tell people the most important part, the most consistently important factor in treatment outcomes is how comfortable that person is with their provider, the professional relationship, right? And so that's what's really important too. So we do that consultation call. I give you whatever information I have, but you have that opportunity to ask whatever questions you have. If you decide to move forward, we book an appointment. First couple of appointments are very much me getting to know you better, getting to a more clear, gathering more information on your background, right? When we're thinking about treatment and everything, it's really important not only to know exactly what symptoms you're experiencing now, but have a better understanding, conceptualization of how this came about, right? So the first couple sessions, 1 to 2 sessions, is really about that. Then you and I can collaboratively form a treatment plan. So again, someone's coming in, for suffering from trauma-related symptoms, whatever it is, we form a treatment plan of this is the protocol we're doing, or this is the approach we're going to do. This is how long, generally speaking, I imagine it could take. Here's what your goal, what are your goals, all these things. And then we start our treatment. Treatment with me specifically, my goal is to get that person out of therapy quicker, right? And not because I'm rushing through things, but the idea is not that you're just amorphously coming in every single week and we're talking about what happened that week, and then a year later, you're still feeling the same way. We have very set goals. We have evidence-based approaches. And what we want to do is get you to the point where you've met your goals, you've regained your sense of control in your life back, and that you have agency so that you no longer feel that you need me anymore at that time. Right? There's some people who also meet their goals and they meet with me once a month, right? Just to check in bi-weekly. We work on new goals, right? But the idea is that we want to get you to your goals so that you can have your life back and not be in therapy forever. Because I think a lot of first responders think that too. Like, once I start, it's not going to stop, right? And that's not really the case if you're working with a provider that is actually, specialized in treating whatever it is you're coming to them with.
I think that's great advice for anything. If you're working with a dietitian, if you're working with a personal trainer, strength and conditioning coach, if their goal is to keep you as a client forever or a patient forever, you might want to look at a different coach.
Yeah.
We really want to help you. We want to get you back on your feet and have you operating autonomously in the world rather than having you on a leash.
Exactly. And there's many, many times that, so let's say we go through a trigger protocol or CPT or whatever it is, and this person's feeling good. They've met their goals. They're doing better. And yet they're like, well, no. I don't want to stop therapy yet. Okay. What's going on? What can we work towards? There's nothing really there. And it's more so just kind of this fear of like, how do I do this on my own? Right. And so that in and of itself is a therapeutic process to work through of like, you have the agency, like you got this. Right. And we got to just kind of address that fear of not having me, right? At some point, I don't want to be a safety crutch, right? When you met your goals, that's great. That's what we want. So that does happen a lot too, is people are like, oh no, I'm never going to kick someone out of my office when they need help. But it's sometimes there's people who are good,
You mentioned much earlier in the podcast that you also work with families. And I want to hit this from maybe a different direction. How can we educate families? Because we hire these new firefighters and we spend the first day with them filling out their HR paperwork and their insurance and all of that stuff. Mm-hmm. And then, most agencies at some point, at least the ones I know of, the union meets with them, perhaps the peer support team. At my agency, I meet with the new personnel, but very few places ever meet with the family. Mm-hmm. So if you had 1 hour to talk to the family, what are the topics that you would kind of hit on?
That's a great question. Okay. I would hit definitely on trauma and stress, meaning this is how trauma and stress, repeated exposure to trauma, just repeated stressful situations, this is how it objectively impacts someone's body and their brain, right? When we're going into constant stress responses, our body's releasing things like adrenaline, our amygdala is going off, we're going into fight or flight mode, we're doing all these different things, right? Over time, that has an impact an objective, identifiable by brain scans impact on someone's actual organs, right? Like their brain. So I would go into that. Like, these are the things. It's not that you just see your partner changing and there's nothing else under the surface happening. There is. Like, the reason you're seeing the outcome of these things, you're seeing the outcome, right? You're seeing what's going on there. My partner's just angry all the time now and blah, blah, blah. Let me tell you what that's related to, right? Let me point to the things in their brain and in their body that's related to. So that would be one thing: stress and trauma and its actual scientific impact on the body and the brain. Sleep, absolutely would go into sleep. Things that you can encourage your partner to do and that even you can get along with, right? If you guys both are used to getting on your phone right when you get into bed to wind down, maybe you both start working on only phones outside. Once we go in the room, phones are off, things like that. I would also, the other big one would be emotions and emotion regulation in general. Basically, talking about how the job can impact their loved one, and how in some ways some of these impacts on the job, like I said, are very adaptive. Things like being able to disconnect emotionally. We can't have it on every call. It affecting us to a deep degree wouldn't be very good at the job, and how that might play out once someone's off the shift. Because it's not like you just get off shift and all of a sudden, whoop, all right, I'm mom, I'm dad, I'm husband, I'm wife, here I am, right? So how that can look, and again, identifiable ways that we can start to kind of do little things to proactively work through that. And a big part of that, again, as you can tell, I'm a big fan of psychoeducation. A big part of that is just teaching the families these things and then learning what it is, putting a face to the name, basically.
I feel like that would be time so well spent, even just an hour or 90 minutes. I think that would be time so well spent. I think it could potentially save a lot of relationships and maybe some lives.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yep.
All right. I want to hit on one more topic before we kind of talk about some of the offerings that you have. Retirement is looming, and I'm not concerned about it. I've been ready for retirement for a very long time, and I have something great to do after retirement. But I think that is not the case with many of our first responders. I think that they identify so strongly with being a first responder that they lose a good portion of the rest of their identity. And then when they retire, there's not much left. So how can we better support our retirees, or how can they better support themselves?
It's a great, great topic and something I'm very, very passionate about. I'll do a lot of talks and trainings on retirement, sometimes even with the probationary, just coming in, and they're like, why the hell is this crazy doctor, this shrink, talking about retirement? I'm just getting started, right?
Because it's so important.
So important, right? So you already really touched on the biggest part of this. So in the limited research that we have, we do see that when a first responder retires, rates of mental health issues skyrocket. We're talking about PTSD, suicide rates go up. This is not a coincidence. A big part of that is that someone loses their identity. As we've talked about, culture, first responder culture for a lot of first responders is their identity, right? I mean, that is not only their job, but it's who they identify as, which is a great thing. And I really like to make it clear that all these aspects of the first responder culture, having a strong identity, the tradition, strength, and resilience, important. I never advocate to get rid of those because they are also protective factors. When we start to have issues is when that balance scale, and I know you guys can't see me, but I'm like moving my hands up and down, shifts from one side to the other. When someone is so invested that is their only identity, when someone has so much camaraderie in the fire service that they don't invest in relationships outside of the fire service, right? That's when we start to have issues, particularly when someone retires. So what's really, really important, just as I say, little things go a long way. Even when you're feeling good. Again, remember, we proactively want to do things now to keep ourselves feeling good later. So what's really important, some little suggestions I give is to find things when we're talking about identity. Identity is tied to our purpose and what fulfills us, right? That's what we mean by identity. And so what we need to do is do things off the job that bring us purpose and that fulfill us. whatever that is to someone, right? Whether it be someone's really into, like me, dogs, right? And so volunteering at some dog rescues, right? Things like that. Whatever it is for someone, whether they're involved in church, I don't know, right? But find fulfillment, things that bring you purpose. They don't need to be big things. You don't need to go on giant retreats every other month, just little things that bring you purpose and fulfillment. So that's one way to create an identity outside of the job. And then the second part of that as well is what we want to do is we want to make sure that we start to really engage in our values, and that's called value-driven behavior. So, for example, say someone really values on a scale of 0 to 10, a 10 out of 10 being a parent, right? And they're like, man, like I told you earlier, I'm having trouble juggling these two things. What we start to do is really want to engage in that value-driven behavior so that when we're no longer all on the job, we already have a very strong foundation in value-driven behavior. So it could be little things, leaving a Post-it note on the fridge because you can't see your kids before you go on shift, leaving a Post-it note to each of your kids, I love you, can't wait to see you when I get back. Little things like that, right? Those are examples of value-driven behavior. The last aspect that I really like to emphasize is fostering and maintaining relationships outside of the job. And I know a lot of first responders who are like, well, why would I do that? I have my brothers and sisters at my job, which again is great. Foster the relationships in the job too. And we want relationships outside of the job. And a lot of first responders are like, well, they don't get me. Like the civilians don't get me. My friends who aren't in the service don't get me, right? Doesn't matter. We want to build that support network. We want to have more and more people in our support back network that we can fall back onto, or who maybe can notice if we're not being ourselves, who bring us fulfillment, who better us as a person. Just limiting it to that one small, crew and not anything outside of that. What happens when someone removes themselves from the job, like in retirement, all of a sudden they feel like they've lost their entire support network. They've lost their social stability, and they're like left with the pieces of, I don't even know how to connect with these people in the world outside of me. So that's another really big one.
I think that's all really, really great advice. And, the other thing that I never realized that once you are retired, most departments within 6 hours, 12 hours, they shut off your email. So like the email address you've had for 20, 30 years, It's just gone. Now I don't think that's going to be an issue for me, but I know that that's an issue for some other people. So
yeah, it's just kind of adding a little bit more of, ouch. All right.
Little insult with the injury.
Yeah, exactly. That's the saying I was looking for. Yeah.
All right, I want to talk about dogs, but not quite yet. How could the listeners work with you? You're in California, so tell me all the ways that people in California or throughout the United States could potentially work with you.
Yeah, so California based, so I provide therapy services specifically for first responders, military, and their loved ones. So unfortunately, due to licensing laws, I can only provide the therapy services for people who live in the state. Now, I can provide them to someone who lives anywhere in the state of California because I do it all through secure video platforms, so telehealth. So anyone living in the state of California can contact me, whether it be, again, them, their loved one, couples, individual and couples therapy, family therapy, etc. However, the cool thing is that I provide my other services like showing up and doing trainings, doing psychoeducation talks, doing wellness visits. I do a lot of content creation, like creating resource manuals for agencies. I could do that anywhere. So I provide those services all over the country. I travel to different states. So the consultation part of things, trainings, critical incident response, all of that I can do anywhere in the country. So, it depends on what someone's looking for, but they can always reach out to me, via my website or via my email for either therapy services or, like I said, agencies and departments can reach out to me for other services as well.
Fantastic. And Any make sure that both of those, your email and your website, get put in the show notes.
Great.
All right. Are there any topics that we should have talked about that I missed? Did I screw this up in any way?
I don't think I think we got a lot in the last 45 minutes, a lot of important stuff.
I think we did pretty good. which means we get to talk
Always
about.
have to come on and talk about other things as well. So,
Well, this now means we get to talk about dogs.
thank goodness.
Tell me the dog information. What's the down low?
So I have two myself. One's named Rocky. He's a very, very fuzzy Australian Shepherd. Very cute. Has a wiggly butt. And the other one is Abigail. And she is a pitty mix. Also very wiggly. And yeah, they're two little best friends. I am definitely a crazy dog person. I, with the owner's permission, of course, will pet any and every dog that comes into a 5-mile radius of me. So
same. I ordered a mug. It said, "Sorry, I'm late. I saw a dog."
There you go.
I'm never late, but it's a good excuse.
I am known among friends and family of, we'll be walking, whatever, we'll be somewhere walking, having a conversation after they'll realize after 30 seconds that they've been talking to no one and I'm not next to them anymore. And they look back and I'm on the ground, petting dogs. And so, yeah, I definitely can relate to that.
Isn't it the worst, though, when you say hi to them and the people think that you're saying hi to the people when you were saying hi to the dog? It's the
always
worst.
Really awkward. Yeah, it's like when you wave to someone and the person behind them waves and you're like, oh, no, how do I not, make them feel bad? But honestly, I just want to pet your dog. So
tell your dog I said hi. That's what.
Yeah.
And then you mentioned you volunteer at a rescue.
Yes. I go to some of the adoption events and things like that. And I have to use every ounce of will in my body to not bring home more dogs. My fiance won't let me. So
I think you should probably send me gratuitous dog pictures after we sign off because I need to see the wiggle butts.
Absolutely.
And what's the second dog, the pitty mix? Annie? Abigail. When you started talking about Abigail, I'm like, I bet it's a pitty mix.
Yep. Yes. There you go. Yeah.
I love them.
Very sweet girl.
Well, Dr. Brooke, it has been my extreme pleasure to have this conversation with you today. Listeners, I'm going to put all of the contact information in the show notes, and I'm sure she would love it if your agency reached out to her to come do a training or something similar. But I think with that, we can probably drop the mic and say Dr. B and AZ are officially